I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So we, Anzaca, acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands, all the associated lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants, elders past, present and emerging. Their sovereignty was never ceded and treaties were never signed, and the First Nations people remain strong in their connection to country and culture. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Though we have no New Zealand participants today, we recognise that we are a binational society. So I take this opportunity to acknowledge the Maori as tangata whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Heath. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the first of many of our professional development events organised by Anzaca. Thank you. I just want to let you know that we will be recording Amanda's presentation, but after that we'll stop recording when we go and just have a chat to each other. It's great to see so many of you have registered for this first session, and our aim is to continually offer a variety of events that takes the fancy of all of our Anzaca members and other academics and researchers and clinicians. And I'll speak a bit more about this after Amanda's presentation. As you have seen in the flyer, our session today is going to focus on collaborations. One of the best things I've found about being a member of Anzaca is how everyone is so open to helping and supporting others. Supporting others can come across as a multitude of ways. You can share your skills and resources. You can offer mentorship. You can review manuscripts, ethics applications, project designs. But basically, the only way we can do any or all of this is through collaborations. So to help us get a better perspective on how collaborations can benefit us, I would like to introduce Dr. Amanda Meyer. Amanda has generously offered to talk about her experience with collaborations and how they have helped her achieve greatness. So let's give a real and virtual round of applause for Amanda.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Well, let me get onto the screen there. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my PowerPoint. I'm just going to say hide that. Okay, so Aaron actually came up with the title of this talk when we were originally talking about it, and he said, you know, collaboration is really about getting more done by working together. And I said, yeah, that's great. We're just going to stick with that title. So I thought I would firstly acknowledge the country that I'm on. So the University of Western Australia, which is the institution that I work at, along with Lloyd White, it's a campus that's situated on Noongar land, and the Noongar people remain the spiritual and custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, belief and knowledge. And today I'm presenting from home on Mandoon country, so welcome from Mandoon. I would like to thank the people that have turned up today or put their hand up to turn up today. We have people from, I think, 13 institutions around Australia. We have 2 different institutions in India, one from Saudi Arabia and one from South Africa. So it's really great to have people from these 4 nations being present today. So about me, I am a first-generation uni graduate. I'm a country girl through and through that lives in the city during the week, and I'm in the country on the weekends. I'm always born and bred in Western Australia, so I'm on the opposite side of the country to Aaron and Heath and the majority of you over on the East Coast. So this is a picture of me recently. I like to hang out wearing my poop-covered akubra from doing cattle inseminations, and I've got some miniature Herefords in the picture behind me. So I'm a senior lecturer at UWA. I've been teaching anatomy. I started really when I was doing my honours and my PhD. Then I took a break having kids. and now they're teenagers. And now I'm back and I've been teaching for 11 years. So like Aaron, I am also going to plan to take my long service leave sometime soon, and I'll have to ask him about tips on that and what to do in that time. I'm also the treasurer of ANZACA, who are putting on this today. ANZACA, I've been involved with ANZACA for a number of years. I think my first conference was the 2015 conference, and since 2018 I've been on the council in one way or the other. I've been a council member for many years and now have moved up into the executive, into the Australian treasurer position. I'm also an editorial board member of the Anatomical Sciences Education Journal, and I am going to put that out there today because a lot of my slides today will have reference to papers and things to do with the Anatomical Sciences Education Journal, so I'll put it out there. I am on the editorial board. I do lots of other things, but really I don't want to sit here and talk about me all day, so if you want to see what else I'm up to, you can look on the UWA Research Repository, or just type in Amanda Meyer UWA, and I don't know what UWA have done, but it comes up straight up on the Google finds, so that's pretty good. So I thought when I was first given this task of putting together a talk about collaboration, I had to reflect back on when was the first time that I really had to seriously think about collaboration. And I can pinprick the moment perfectly. I was at ANZACA in December 2015. I was standing in the poster section, and a very prominent professor of medical education came up and was reading my study on my poster. And then he turned to me and said, "Amanda, you'll never get a single institution study published in a top journal. You need to collaborate, you need to do multi-institutional studies to get published in top journals." And I thought, oh my gosh, I hadn't even considered that. I was, I think, 3 or 4 years into teaching. I was flat out with teaching and only really doing cohort studies in my own classroom. So then I started thinking, well, what are the top anatomy journals? And I know that all of you will be familiar with one of these journals or the rest. So this is a table that I grabbed off of Researchify yesterday. Looking at the top anatomy journals, we've got Anatomical Sciences Education, which is the top ranked anatomy journal. It has a very large impact score, which is more than double General Anatomy, which is the next one. Then we have Anatomical Record, third, Annals of Anatomy, fourth, Clinical Anatomy, Anatomical Sciences International, Surgical and Radiological Anatomy, Folia Morphology, and Anatomy and Cell Biology, which I think is the journal of the Korean Anatomy Association. So I'm sure that all of you have published in one of these, or will soon, hopefully, publish in one of these amazing journals. So at Anatomical Sciences Education, what happens to your paper or your article once you submit it? Well, unfortunately, 40% are rejected without review. So that means that it's gone to the editors or the sub-editors, associate editors, and they have either found a massive flaw with the study, or it's really not within the scope of the journal, so it's been desk rejected. 30% are rejected after they've been reviewed, so that means that they've been through either 1 or 2 rounds of review, and that goes out to 3 or 4 or maybe more reviewers. And only 30% are accepted. So we need to work out what we can do to make sure that we are in that 30% of articles that are being accepted. So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to propose to you today that we can do that by 2 ways. The first is working on our study design, so to make sure that we have a very rigorous study design. And also collaboration. So by having multiple institutions, you're going to increase the number of observational studies or N number. You're also going to take advantage of technologies or grants or other things that are available at other universities that might not be available at yours. So I'm going to talk a bit about study design, and I thought I'd better put a disclaimer in there that I am 95% of the time a quantitative researcher. I do dabble a little bit in qualitative studies, but I'm a basic science PhD, and I guess my skill set is more leaning towards the quantitative researcher side. When I need to do qualitative studies, that's when I will pick up collaborators who are good at qualitative research. And one of those is Margaret McNulty. A lot of you might know her from Twitter. She's in Indiana. She's a fabulous quant and qual researcher, so we team up and make a pretty good team, if I say so myself. She's great to work with. So when you go for your study design, generally we will find it easy to come up with a research idea. We will be, floating around looking at Twitter, we'll read a paper, we'll be reflecting on what's happened in our classroom, and we'll come up with an idea. That's the easy part. The next part is actually doing the homework. So heading to your university library or going to Google, and I've put a little asterisk here that for Anatomical Sciences Education Journal, we have found that more than 50% of people end up with our research papers purely by Googling. So they're either going just through a straight Google search or through Google Scholar. So if you don't have access to a university search engine, just use Google. Okay, so it's free and you can use it. So make sure you do a systematic review of the literature. So that means you're going to find keywords and you're going to structure your search with Boolean operators, so and or and things like that. And if you don't know what that means, now is the time to go make friends with your librarian or just type in Boolean operators. Librarians are an underutilized person, and in a lot of academic institutions. Get to know your librarians. They will be absolute lifesavers. So you do your systematic review of the literature. You now find out what everyone else has found out on that subject, and that allows you to then find the niche, find that gap in the literature that your study can now fill. Then you go back to your original research idea, you look at all the literature and you really refine that research question. And you're going to refine that into a hypothesis, which remember is an idea that you can test. So when you're doing your research design, when you start thinking about the methodologies that you're going to use, you have to make sure that they are really designed to answer the question that you've posed. And a lot of the time I find that when I'm reviewing papers, I will see a kind of a research question at the end of the introduction, and then the methodology is completely wrong to answer that question. And that happens again and again, and that's something I would really like to get out to people submitting papers. Just stop and have a bit more of a think before you jump into doing that research study. It can save you hours and hours and days and months of trouble. You then have to think, what is the best way of conducting this study? Is this going to be an observational study, or is this going to be an experimental study? If it's an observational study, who is your population? If an experimental one, what is your intervention going to be? Now again, taking on feedback from papers and theses that I review, is when you're doing an experiment and doing a intervention, you need to make sure that that intervention is actually going to have the effect that you want. I think a lot of people don't spend enough time looking at their intervention. Do you honestly think a 20-minute intervention is going to have a long-term impact on a student's learning? I think the answer is probably not. There's probably going to be a lot of confounding variables in there. So you really need to think about designing those interventions that are going to be substantial and are going to have a large effect on the learning, hopefully. You also need to think about, if you're doing an experimental group, who is going to be your control group and who is going to be your experimental group. You need to randomize. Please randomize your students into control and their experimental groups. If you are worried about having a control or experimental group in an educational setting, it's really easy to overcome that by doing a crossover study. So you'll have one group being the control, one group being the experimental group, and then you swap over. And the good thing of that is that the students become their own controls as well. So that's really good. Another top tip that that I've been seeing a lot lately is don't get anonymous surveys of your students. Anonymize them after you've collected the data and matched them up. Okay, it's really hard to say that you've had a really good effect if you can't follow the subjects through and show that you've had a good effect on your students. Also, you've got to think about what other confounding variables are there. Can you control everything in that learning environment? Are the students accessing other resources outside of class time? How much is that contributing to the learning effect that you're seeing? So these are things that need to be addressed in your limitations. So I found these studies, and I know everyone is probably very familiar with the evidence level or hierarchy, and we know that really for our studies we want to head towards the top of the pyramid. So the bottom is the expert opinion, so these are our kind of letters to the editor. The next highest level is case series and case reports. They're pretty hard to publish. The next group is the observational studies and comparison groups. So we have a lot of educational papers that fall into this group. Then as we move up, we go into our non-randomized controlled trials, which a large proportion of papers fall in. We will have quite a few randomized controlled trials, and they are, as you can see, the second highest level of evidence. And then right at the top, we have our systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So if we want to have the most rigorous study, we're going to move up towards the top of this pyramid. And I really liked this simple kind of map for study designs shown here on the right-hand side. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of different studies, but kind of looking at splitting studies into either descriptive studies or analytical studies. And for the descriptive, you can either have a cross-sectional survey of the populations or a qualitative survey. And for analytic, you can either have an experimental where you're introducing a intervention, and they can be either randomized parallel groups running side by side, or the randomized crossover, which is particularly good for educational papers. We can then have the observed analytical designs with cohort studies, which is what a lot of us do when we're just focusing on our own cohort. Cross-sectional analytic, this is a good one for when we are doing cross or multi-institution studies. And then case controls, but remember, case controls are going to be much lower on that pyramid. So two designs that fit particularly well for collaborative study designs, and I will again say here, I've picked two papers that are well known in anatomical sciences education. The first type that lends itself to collaboration is the cross-sectional study. So the cross-sectional study is looking at a snapshot in time across a number of different groups that are generally of the same population. So it's an observational study, and can be quantitative or qualitative, i.e. you can get numbers or you can use open-ended questions and get a qualitative feedback, and then use a thematic analysis approach to then look at that data. And so a good example of that is a paper, and a few of us here today contributed to this paper. So this was a paper that we put together, really led by Nalini and Michelle, and we can see here that we've got authors from 12 different institutions across Australia and New Zealand. And we surveyed with open and closed questions and produced this quantitative and qualitative cross-sectional study. And this has been, I think, cited over 156 times according to the metrics on ASE, but 290 times according to Google Scholar. So take whichever one. I'm not sure who's more up to date. Another really good example of a collaborative study design is doing a systematic analysis or a meta-analysis. Both of these types take thousands of papers, then you have to extract the data, synthesize the data, and I like to think of collaboration in this sense as many hands make light work. And so a great example of this is another ASC paper, this one by Adam Wilson. Michelle Lazarus, one of our members, is the senior author on this paper. And you can see that they had educators from 7 different institutions, and they broke down into teams of 2. So when they did their original analysis, they came up with 3,035 studies. They then went through their PRISMA guidelines, extracted 327 to do a full text review, then narrowed that down to 26 studies that were going to get the full-on review, and that was done by teams of 2. So that makes a massive job a lot smaller if you have more people working on it. Okay, so I thought, again, at this point, I would point out some research flaws. And again, I come at this from a lens of reviewing lots of papers and theses for a number of journals. I review, oh my gosh, I think I'm already up to number 6 for this year. So I review for Anatomical Sciences Education Journal, Journal of Anatomy, BMC Med Online. I think that's the key journals that I do multiple papers for. I do ones here and there as well. So what are these research flaws and how do we stop doing them? Okay, so a huge flaw that I see firstly, and this becomes evident when you're reading a paper or a thesis in the introduction. So when they haven't done a thorough review of the literature. And this is why starting your study with a systematic review of the literature can be really helpful to avoid this. You can even publish the systematic review as the first paper in your series. So you need to have enough literature set out in your research paper that makes your hypothesis a really good idea to test. You need to clearly show the reviewer what is the logical arguments set up and what is the gap in the knowledge and why you're filling it. You need to think about the study design. So again, based on that research question, have you designed the correct study to address that research question? And a lot of the time, those two things aren't linking up in papers that get rejected. A lot of the time, we have lots of cohort studies come through and the educators haven't used any type of baseline control. So an idea of something that you can use as a baseline control would be to use students' GPA or something that, you know, is characteristic or weighted average mean or something that gives you a baseline measure of those students. You also need to do a pre-test to kind of see where they're at, and you need to make sure then that you then randomise students into either control or intervention groups. I did allude to before making interventions and thinking about what is going to be a good intervention. So think about the learning resources you're going to use, the time you're going to dedicate to that in class, and how you're going to control students not using or using those resources outside of classrooms. If you are using surveys, you need to make sure that you validate them, and that means that instead of just picking up a survey and dumping it into your research design, you need to actually find out what populations that survey has been used in. Is that population similar to yours? A really good way of validating it is to run it in a pilot group of your population and then run a principal components factor analysis. And then once you run that, you can then see how many themes are pulled out or how many factors are pulled out. And you can see if it behaves, that survey behaves the same way in your population as it does in the published studies. So you should always do that. And then, of course, when you have validated your surveys, you need to report to the reviewers what your Cronbach's alpha is, so your reliability of your study, or if you're using categorical values, what your Cuda-Richardson 20 value is. When you are looking at methods for assessing whether an educational intervention has worked, you need to really align the assessment method with the way that you taught them. So, for example, this is not picking on anyone's research, coming off the top of my head. If you were teaching students how to palpate the brachial pulse, and you kind of went through a knowledge, skills and attitude kind of marking rubric, you wouldn't then go and test them on that knowledge by doing a multiple choice test. The assessment method doesn't fit the teaching method. So you need to find a way of assessing that matches or melds in with the teaching practice. A lot of the times the assessment methods that are used in papers are too small. They'll be maybe 10 items and a 10-item pre-test and a 10-item post-test. If there are multiple factors or concepts that those 10 items are going across, it doesn't make it a valid, or it really reduces the validity of that survey and the reliability of that survey. So I really want people to think about aligning their assessment methods with their teaching methods. And then the statistical analyses. I know most people hate statistics. Numbers like that tend to scare a lot of people, but really statistics, when you break it down, it's not that hard. And we have Google now, which is really great. So there are YouTubes for how to do a t-test, how to run an ANOVA, how to run chi-square analysis. So if you don't know how to do it, use Google. Another thing, and this is something that I say to my students as well, when you get data, oh, sorry, I just saw a pussycat come up on the screen. I got distracted. You can edit that part out, Aaron. When you are looking at you get your data, the first thing I want you to do is throw it up on a plot. So put it on a scatter plot and look at your data. Looking at your data gives you a great idea about if there's going to be differences between, say, means of different groups on the right-hand side, or looking if there's going to be a relationship between the variables, and you'll be able to understand if it's a positive correlation between the two factors, a negative correlation between the two factors, or in fact there is no correlation. So listen to what your data is telling you and use the appropriate statistical tests. Don't not look at your data and then torture it with enough statistical tests to try and pop out a low p-value. So how do you choose the right test? Well, first off, you've got to think, why am I doing these statistics? Why have I done this study? So this goes back to your research question. What are you aiming to do? Do you want to compare the means between groups? Do you want to look at the differences in proportions between groups? Are you wanting to look at relationships between groups or different factors? So each one of these requires a different statistical test. What we also need to do after we've thrown our data up on a scatter plot, we also need to look and see, are they normally distributed? So, you know, do they follow that nice curve, or are they skewed in some way? Are they skewed to the left? Is the curve skewed to the left or the right? And so you need to test for that before you really do any statistics. You need to perform a normality test to see if your data is normal. And if your data is normally distributed, you can use parametric tests. But if it's not normally distributed, you're going to have to use non-parametric tests. Now, the smaller your sample size, usually the more non-parametric or skewed your data will be. So if you were doing a cohort study, you're probably more likely to end up doing non-parametric testing. So here's a kind of simple flow chart. I found this on Twitter, and this is used in high school biology. Don't look at the formulas. You don't have to think about the formulas. But I liked that it really broke down the thinking behind what test to use. And so firstly, you've got to remember that the two assumptions of parametric or normally distributed data is that one, that they are normally distributed, and two, that the samples are unbiased and that they are independent. So then we look to see what type of data are we looking at. Are we looking at continuous numbers, or are we looking at discrete or categorical kind of yes, no type questions? If we are looking at categorical yes, no questions, we're going to look at chi-squared analysis, and that will report to us the proportion of yeses or nos and if that's different. Couldn't be other dichotomous or even more different groups, but that's just an example. If you are looking at the difference between means, you're going to, if you've only got two treatment groups and that the two groups are the same group, one before and one after interventions, you can do a paired t-test as long as you don't anonymize the data. And if you haven't, or if you have anonymized your data, you're going to have to do an unpaired t-test to test between two groups. If you have more than two groups, you're going to go do a one-way analysis of variance, which is an ANOVA. And if you want to look at the relationships, so looking at a regression analysis, you're going to perform a regression test. So there's different types of regression. So you can have your linear regression test when you're on a continuous variable, or if you're doing a categorical yes, no, you can do what's called a, oh no, I've just forgotten, a logistic regression. It's been a while since I've done one of those. Okay, so hopefully you're not too scared of statistics now, and you might start thinking, well, I don't have a statistical program. How can I do this? If you have Microsoft Excel, you can do these statistics. SPSS is what I have always used up until this year. I now don't have a license for it. I need to work out how to use R, and apparently there's Python. I don't know anything about Python apart from that's a scary snake, in my opinion. So choosing the right test. So before we were talking about those parametric tests, but they're also non-parametric tests. So again, if you're looking at unpaired data, instead of doing a t-test on parametric data, you'll be doing a Mann-Whitney U-test. So that means you've got not normally distributed data comparing the groups. Really, if you're looking at not normally or non-parametric data, you should really be reporting the median and the mode, not the mean, because means are reported for parametric. And you can also see that with paired data for the non-parametric, we can go and instead of doing a repeated measures ANOVA, we can do a Friedman's ANOVA. So all of these things you can find anywhere on the internet the right test to find what you need to do. Now, going and applying that back to this research paper that we are trying to get published in a top anatomy journal, we need to report the results that we find from our statistical analyses in the correct fashion. And again, if you're not sure how, go and Google, how do I report results in or of this test? And an example, because I know lots of you use one-way ANOVAs, is to report the F value and the P value, and actually don't just say less than 0.05, put the actual P value in there. Okay, so we've looked at research design flaws. Now it's a little bit more personal, looking at writing flaws. And again, this is my personal opinion. I'm not the best writer in the world, but it helps if you are a good writer, or you have someone on your team that's really good at writing, it does help to make that paper or that narrative easier to read, which then increases the chance that that is going to be published. So when you are writing your introduction, make sure this is after you've done your systematic review. You are building up that evidence to support your hypothesis. So you really want to see that nice logical flow flowing through your introduction. For your results, make sure you do the statistics and then report them accordingly. A lot of the time, I'm guessing that some people have given off their data to a statistician. They get a paragraph back from the statistician and they chuck that in their methods, and then their results don't even report the proper statistical test. So make sure you have consistency between what you write in your methods and what results that you are reporting. And then, of course, your discussion. So usually by the time you've got to the discussion as a reviewer, you are now probably on to page 30 or something, and you're getting pretty tired. So the discussion needs to really hit home. That first paragraph really needs to hit home what your key finding was and why that is awesome. And then kind of go on in the rest of your discussion to talk about how your results fit with the known literature. So compare and contrast your findings with what other people have found in the field. Most importantly, make sure you do include limitations section. So this really shows that you have reflected on your process and that you've used critical analysis. So think about when you're doing studies. If you're doing a cohort study, a key limitation is that this is a single institution study. If you had perhaps performed this study across multiple institutions, you would have a higher N number, and that perhaps would give more validity to your research. So how do we avoid these flaws in research design and writing? It's by peers. It's by collaborating. And I love this quote by Kenneth Blanchard that none of us is as smart as all of us. So if we put our heads together, I'm sure that we can work out how to avoid all of these flaws. And these next couple of slides are really, I've taken inspiration from a couple of the AIRY tweets that have been held recently. I think it was in Indiana. And these were some tweets, I think, by Valerie O'Loughlin. And the benefits of teamwork really are that you get together people who have multiple and different skill sets. So I said earlier that my skill set really is quantitative analysis and statistics, and Margaret's is quantitative and also qualitative research. And so that really helps me. We have multiple viewpoints. We all have a different lived experience. We all probably teach slightly different cohorts of students. We all have slightly different research ideas. We have very different life experiences, and this all helps to generate these multiple viewpoints. And sometimes there's just something out of the park that you haven't thought of, and the other person can bring that to the table and really augment the study. You also have shared responsibilities. I know we are all incredibly busy, and thanks for attending today. So having multiple people in a team makes the division of labour easier. It's not all falling on the one person. You can spread out the load, and you can also make people responsible for certain parts of the project, and that's going to lead to increased accountability. If you are just left to do a study by yourself, chances are it's probably going to fall right down your to-do list. But if you are collaborating with people, you don't want to let them down, and you will actually put that further up the top of your to-do list and get it done. So teams, what does it mean? Together, everyone achieves more. Okay, so I want that to be your mantra from now to forever. And think about how to build your team. So think about reaching beyond your institution. Doing that is going to allow you to find people from different institutions to build up your team. Make sure you get to know each other. A good way of getting to know each other, if you're not at the same university or if you're not on the same continent, is to learn about each other or get to know each other via social media. We also have these amazing platforms like Gather, like Teams, like Zoom, like Skype, where we can actually meet and video chat online and get to know each other. When you're building your team, you need to have shared values. So you need to have a common interest, a common goal, and be willing and able to come together for the team and make that happen. You also need to be really good at spotting strengths, and that is not only in yourself but in others. And by strengths, I don't mean how much you can lift. I'm talking about what is the skill set that you can do better than anyone else in that group, or what is that skill set that allows you to feel happy and that you can do this thing all day long. For me, I love statistics and I could do stats all day long, but I'm a bit of a nerd. So once you find someone who has a strength, and particularly if that's not a strength of yours, grab onto them and hold onto them and use them in your collaborations. And most importantly, when you start a collaborative project, have a plan, map everything out, even down to authorship spots on papers, plan out your papers and then stick to that. If you vary from that, you're going to have a group meeting and sort that out. So how do you find teammates? You join associations. So you've all joined ANZACA, you've come along today. So this is a great way of finding teammates. But are you also members of the American Association for Anatomy or the Anatomical Society or AACA or BACA? There's so many different associations of anatomy. And so the more associations that you're part of, the larger your field of teammates is. Social media is a really great way to find teammates. That's really how I found my teammates because I'm from Perth. We're the most isolated capital city in the world. So to find other teammates, I had to go online and look for people. And also, a good way to find teammates is to keep up with the literature or read the top anatomy journals and find out who's doing studies that you're interested in. And then that allows you to then contact those people and see if they want to collaborate. So how did I find mine? I found mine on Twitter. You can see here, 2015, I joined Twitter and I now follow over 1,000 anatomists and have over 3,000 followers. And so on my Twitter account, it's mostly a professional account, and I will talk about research and teaching and scholarship and things like that. And here's my world domination map. Anyone know any anatomists in Iceland and Greenland? So the darker the colour, the more followers you have with tweets map. So I have more of a influence or a following in Australia, Canada and the US, I think, and looks like India as well, which is really great. And by being out on Twitter, it got or it enabled a lot of people to reach out to me for collaborations. And it also helped me do lots of projects. And I think the one that is kind of most stuck in my mind right now as I'm saying this is when I was offered to go to the AAA conference for the first time in 2017, I think it was. I just got a DM from Mike Pascoe and David Morton, and they said, hey, we really love your tweets. Can you collaborate with us on this project? And, a couple of months later, I was over, I think it was in Chicago that year, and I met a whole bunch of people, lots of people as I walked up the escalator going, hey, that's Amanda Meyer, PhD from Twitter. So that's the importance of looking like your profile picture as well, so people recognize you when we do have face-to-face conferences and we don't have our faces covered. Okay, so what does my research network actually look like? So this is taken from my university, and it's just a little map there from, I think, 2017 onwards. And it shows, so I'm actually over here, down the bottom here in Perth. And you can see that I collaborate a lot with people over East, also people in New Zealand, people in England and Ireland, and lots of people in the US. Also do collaborate, we haven't published it yet, but with lots of people in Canada. So again, this research network was enabled by going on to social media and finding collaborators. Another thing that this has helped us do with Twitter was, I think it was last year or the year before, when the pandemic, I think it was in the middle of the pandemic, I kind of said, I threw out a tweet and it was something like, who's teaching neuroanatomy at the moment? And I suddenly got a whole heap of people together, and through a series of chats and DMs with the whole group, we decided that we needed to put together an application for the AAA to develop the global neuroanatomy network. And then we got $50,000 US from AAA to do that. And as you can see from the list, you probably recognize those names. So we have people from Australia, Canada, Ireland, India, Portugal, US, I'm looking down the list, Argentina, Philippines, UK, if I haven't said that already, and Brazil. So we have a really great international collaboration. This all came out from just a simple tweet on Twitter, which then led to a group, which then led to this application, which led to funding, and now we're developing this amazing resource. Okay, so quick little drink break for me, and then I'll get back onto this one. Okay, so once we've got our research paper, we've found our collaborators, we've done a great study design, we've published our paper, then how do we get it out into the world? A great way of doing that is by open access. And a lot of universities may or may not have access to open access, but because a lot of the people coming today were from Australia, I thought New Zealand, but we don't have anyone. A lot of the universities, 39 out of 52, are part of what's called the Council of Australian University Librarians, or CAUL. And what that is a group of libraries that have come together as a consortium, and then they have made a transformative deal with publishers. And so what happens is that now all of those people at those institutions, those 39 institutions, can now publish open access in a number of journals that are held by that publisher. So for instance, again, I'm going to go back to anatomical sciences education. Wiley has made a deal with CAUL. So that means if you are at any of these institutions in Australia and New Zealand and you publish in anatomical sciences education, you can get open access for free. So you need to check with your uni, and there's a good way of, and I think the next slide I'll show you that. And if your uni doesn't have it, big tip, go and collaborate with someone who isn't a university that's part of that call, because then that will help you get your stuff out there. This is the form that you get if you go to the Wiley page. And so they're talking about, all you do is stick in your information here on the right-hand side. And Wiley haven't given any references for this, but they're saying that open access increases your downloads about 3 times, citations about 1.5 times, and boosts your altmetric score by 2.7 times. So why do open access? Of course, these are kind of no-brainers. You get more exposure for your work. You can have higher citation rates, which are really great. It's what your university likes to see. Hopefully you can influence some policy. The public can find your access. You're compliant with grant rules, so you can get your research out there. No, not sure what taxpayers really implies here, but this one here, looking through a lens of diversity, equity and inclusion, it's really great that we can actually get the research out to researchers in developing countries. So a recent paper looking at a randomized controlled trial, remember that is a high level of evidence, looking at the effect of the altmetric score on manuscript citations. They grabbed a whole heap of papers that had the same baseline score of altmetric. They then took half the papers and tweeted about them. They took the other half and didn't tweet about them. And what they found was that articles that were tweeted about were 1.4 times more likely to be cited, and that they had a much higher altmetric score, and that was really largely driven by tweets. So Twitter really is a great place. Aaron, get back on. A really great place to disseminate your research and to boost those altmetric scores and those citation rates. So things to ask your potential collaborators. So these are some questions that you might think about asking, or at least think over when you're talking to people about collaborations. Is number 1, what are you working on? And if you went to the Padlet in the room a bit earlier, you could see what everyone is working on and what are some other kind of side interests. You can ask them what populations or students do they teach, what topics do they teach, when do you teach, what are your strengths. If you are not doing educational research, of course, that can come down to what animal types are you studying, what model are you using, and things like that. Things to consider as well is that you need to have this area of alignment between the collaborators. So have a look at what they're doing, what you're doing. Is there some alignment between you? And it doesn't have to be 3, it can be more. You don't want to have a massive, massive group, but 3 authors is a really great start for a collaboration. And make sure there is a good fit. When we have a good fit, we then benefit from synergism, which then augments our research process, also makes us feel good, and we get a lot more done. So really, we are aiming for that sweet spot in the middle. Okay, we all want that sweet spot. And my key shout out is, or thing that I want you to take home, is that collaboration should spark joy. Nobody wants to be part of a group that they hate being a member of. Everyone wants to enjoy the writing process, and you want it to be a pleasurable experience. And so think about what collaborations have sparked joy for you. Think about what collaborations didn't spark joy for you. And if you are in a collaboration that is not sparking joy, jump ship. Get out of there as pleasantly as you can. So it's easy to get started. We are going to have a chat after this. But as an example, I thought a few weeks ago, I'm just going to chuck out on Twitter again, who's teaching histology for the next few months? And within 24 hours, I had 13 collaborators from 4 different countries who said, yeah, we want to do a research study with you. So now it's up to me, because I chucked it out, to find time to make this project. And of course, this has been my my priority this week. And next week I start teaching across 3 units. So I'm going to find some time. But really what I need to do is to look at everyone's population of students and try find a project that is multi-institutional. So this is likely to be a cross-sectional study, because it's going to be very hard to do an experimental study across that many different institutions, because you just can't hold lots of factors in control. So help me to help you. So this is another key slide that I want you to think about. So I want you to find collaborators, either here, in your institution, on Twitter, anywhere you can. Leverage their strengths and develop new skills. Okay, take advantage in a nice way of what others have to offer you. Publish. So maximize your chance of publishing in a top journal by having a rigorous study design and great collaborators. Also make sure that you're collaborating with someone that is part of the call, so they will get open access papers. And that comes down to the next point in dissemination. So maximize your dissemination of your research with open access papers and also social media to promote it, and particularly Twitter. And then demonstrate the impact of your work using metrics and, of course, a narrative that goes with that for your awards and promotions. And when I sent that particular slide to Aaron last night, and I'll thank him for his late night contributions, he came up with this, and I thought, yeah, that is absolutely perfect. And so a way of taking those and applying it to yourself is, I collaborated so I could reach more people with my findings, which led to, in my case, it led to trips to America. It led to more research projects. It led to me being invited to various working groups in IFAA. Collaborating led to my student or me developing skills I did not have, which were, for me, I'm learning very slowly about how to use in vivo and do qualitative research. Other people will be learning how to do statistics. So we need to find someone who has a different skill set to us. Without publishing in a top journal, me or my student wouldn't have been able to spread our important findings as wide. And of course, if we're not spreading our research as wide, we are not getting as many citations. And so we really need to try and aim for the top. And if we can't get into that one, then we'll try and find a home slightly further down the ladder. And then collaborations have led to years of positive outcomes, which has really improved the student experience and led us to success in teaching awards. And I think that is the part that I think really hit home, that is demonstrating that impact. Why are we doing research? We're doing research to really, in education, to improve the student experience. We're not just doing it to get papers, to get citations, to get the promotion. I think particularly in ANZACA, we are all, at least very, that I know of, we are very focused on improving the student experience, which is wonderful. And of course, it does lead to success in teaching awards and does lead to promotion. So alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much. And to finish, I really want you right now for a couple of minutes at your desk to reflect on who you want to collaborate with and why, or who you've enjoyed collaborating with and why. And then that might give you some tips when we move into our next stage of today to then work out some collaborations. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. For 18 people who are still left, thank you for hanging on to the end of my talk, and I will hand over back to Aaron.